Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan podcast. This podcast is conducted in association with Juggernaut. Today, we have with us Miss Gitanjali Kolanad, who's just written the book Girl Made of Gold, which was released a few days back. This fascinating book is set in the 1920s and revolves around the concept of a devadasi, that is, a traditional dancer dedicated to a deity in South India, particularly in Tamil Nadu. What she does is use fiction to write about some real life experiences and anecdotes and has woven a beautiful mystery masterpiece. Without any further delay, let's dive into this interview.
Hello, everyone. Before we begin this interview, I would like to apologize to Ms. Gitanjali and my listeners because uh, my pronunciation about a lot of words might be slightly off, but uh, I hope that doesn't interrupt or ruin anyone's experience of listening to this podcast. Welcome, Gitanjali. Welcome to the Kitabi Karwan podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right. So, Gitanjali, this is something I do with every interviewee I have, wherein I I would like you to describe yourself, but not in the way the blurb of your book or the internet would. I want to know about you. It, it has to go beyond, like that's something that's really curious for me and my listeners. We want to know who you are, right? So,
well, the blurb on the book says about my being a dancer, and I feel like being a dancer is completely so interwoven into my character, into my being, that to talk about myself without talking about being a dancer, the experience of being a dancer, is almost impossible. So that's the blurb and the person are both interwoven that way for sure. Um, and I think it has to do with the quality of being a dancer. You know, you have to change your musculature, you have to learn a particular way of moving and all that kind of thing. So I think it's really tied into my being. Otherwise, I really love cooking. I really love gardening. I really love reading. And those are the things that are very important to me, other than a dance. And of course, Kalari Payet. I kind of hold the two together in my being. Kalari Payet, the martial art form, and Bharatanatyam, the dance form.
right. So, so Gitanjali, you mentioned so as you're a Bharatanatyam practitioner, and you mentioned how dance is this integral part of your being. Um, how did your journey with dance start? Like, did this start as a kid? Did you discover this into late in your life? How is this? How were you introduced to this world of Bharatanatyam?
It's really incredible because I had never really seen it before. Maybe I'd seen it as a kid. I certainly don't remember. But when I was 16, I went to India, and that's kind of all detailed in the short stories in my first collection, Sleeping with Movie Stars, about going to India as a 16-year-old who had been brought up in Canada, didn't really understand India that well, and was taken by my parents. And I went to Kalakshetra more as a way to get away from my grandparents than because I knew what Bharatanatyam was, but it just seemed like, they'll let me go there because there's a hostel. And then when I went there, I just simply fell in love with it. I describe the experience like that because it doesn't seem to be very much tied to the qualities of the dance itself. It's like that feeling of falling in love where you don't know why you're in love with the person. And it's the same with the dance. I can't really tell you why, but I saw it there at Kalakshetra and I simply just fell in love with them. And it has many qualities: beauty of lines, this rhythmic component, a kind of clarity of form and structure that I really enjoyed. All those things, but if you why Bharatanatyam and not Odissi, or why Bharatanatyam and not Kathak? I honestly, it really was just like a feeling of just falling in love with it. And then after that, I just stayed on. There
Right,
was no longer a need to escape from anybody or do anything. I just wanted to be there
right,
and study.
right. Oh, actually really fascinating when you mention that, because so I have a younger sister who's learned Bharatanatyam. She had her Arangetram at the end of December 2018. And I remember my first brush with Bharatanatyam's depth. I mean, I always knew that, it's a dance form, but I remember, I think once she had an exam for one of the stages, I guess, and she asked me to help her with her, revise or something. And she gave me a book, and I was really or like in no offense, but I was taken aback, because in my head, this was back when I was about 14 or 15, and I was not a huge fan of dancing in general. So I had no idea about the technicalities of it. So I was taken aback when I saw, okay, there's a book involved with a dance form as well, right? Right. I was like, to the extent that, and I opened it up, and it detailed all these hand gestures which had
Mm,
different meanings.
mm.
And she just asked me to, like, see, test her if she remembers them correctly or not. And
Okay.
I remember being absolutely fascinated when I found that out, because till that point of time I did not associate uh, any meaning to these gestures, right? Like, for me as an audience member, it was just, okay, the dance is doing something which probably fits the beats or the music. But it's just, that's when I realized, and that's when I first kind of had this weird brush with dancing, and I realized that, oh, okay, so there is a lot more depth to what the performers doing, and they're trying to narrate something, and there's this entire story to what the dance is actually happening on stage. So that brings me to my next question, which uh, so this is something I realized in India, wherein in my personal interactions with a few people, there's woefully a lack of knowledge about ancient dances, right, or Indian dances in general. And I mean, I'm no one. I'd be hypocritical to say that I'm not one of those people, right? I have some bare
Mm,
knowledge, that too, just because my sister's a dancer. But something that I noticed was, even in the dancing community, Bharatanatyam seen more like, or dance forms are often seen as technical performances rather than cultural relics, right? As they are
mm.
today, right? How they capture almost centuries of culture and evolution into this beautiful dance form. So, do you think that is actually an issue dance forms are facing today, to the extent that people are no longer associating them with the cultural depth that they require, or the purity that they were evolved with, and they're being just seen as technical dance forms that someone just learns and is just done with?
You know, a dance form only exists as a living tradition.
Right,
So it can't exist if people aren't making it uh, what they want it to be.
right,
So what it was 100 years ago, what it was 50 years ago, like just in my lifetime, over my lifetime of being involved in dance, which is almost exactly 50 years since I started learning about it at Kalakshetra,
right,
it's changed immensely.
right,
It's undergone all kinds of refinements or technical, like lighting, sound, very very technical
right,
aspects of it have changed entirely, and the music has changed. The dress, the costume has changed. The attitude of dancers to their form has also
right,
changed. It has to. If it was satisfying for me 50 years ago, and uh, kids who do it now within this context, they've grown up in an entirely different environment. They have a different visual understanding because they're constantly involved with screens So they think differently about movement. They think very differently about what it would involve them. And so I have no interest in trying to say this it was great 50 years ago and it's
Right.
not great now. It's changing and it's evolving to meet the needs of young people today. I want to say women because it's mostly young women, girls and young women, but
Right.
boys can do Bharatanatyam too, and young men can do Bharatanatyam too. And whatever it is, it has to be inviting and enough that you I mean, your sister, how hard she works.
Yeah.
And if she is to work that hard, it has to give her something back. And as as soon as it stops doing that, people will stop doing it. They'll move on to breakdancing or something else. And so I want to see Bharatanatyam continuously alive. And to be alive means it's not a museum. It's not like, this is the way my teacher taught me. This is exactly the way I'm going to do it. That's how you take something dead and put it in the museum. And Bharatanatyam is not like that. And I would never want it to
Right.
be that.
It's fascinating that you brought up this anecdote about like how people would move on if they don't really like the dance form, right? And
Mm,
it's I don't know, it's I think it's a thought worth considering for a lot of people how we live today in in this world of instant gratification, where every form of entertainment or pleasure that we derive has to be, minimized into these smaller packets rather than these elaborate performances which people,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And it's just so fast, and it's fascinating when you even apply this to dance, right? Like, I mean, it applies to every other field, but dance as well, right?
50 years ago, I'm telling you, there was not a single Bharatanatyam performance that was less than 3 hours. 50
Wow.
years ago, that was the norm. You
Right.
go to see a performance, 3 hours. Varanam itself used to be about an hour, 45 minutes to an
Right.
hour was considered normal for the Varanam. So,
Right.
who's going to do that now? Who's going
Yeah.
to
Yeah, no,
go and
exactly.
sit?
And it's right, great that you brought it up, because my sister's Arangetram, that's one of my only experiences experiencing Bharatnatyam, which is supposed to be this huge event in her life, right? Lasted three
Mm,
hours and people thought it was
mm,
long, right?
mm,
And just contrast this with what you just said, like in
yeah,
general, Bharatnatyam performance is 3 hours long. So an
yeah,
Arangatra might have been slightly longer, or this, it just
yeah.
gives this context to these things. But Gitanji, just taking you on another tangent. Uh, so coming to your book, Girl Made of Gold, what was your I know. How did this idea germinate? Where did the seed come from? How did this book emerge?
Somebody told me a story at a dinner, and that
Mm.
and the the I have been ever since I was in my 30s anyway, maybe not in my 20s, but I can't remember exactly, but between my 20s and my 30s, I really started to want to know how Bharatanatyam came to exist in the form that I was learning it, and why. And when I was doing all this research into the form and trying to connect the research to my own experience of
Hmm.
Bharatanatyam and the way that I saw my friends who were mainly dancers, how they responded to it, and the dances that I responded to. When I was doing that research, I realized that an academic understanding of how the dance form came to be doesn't really convey the experience. So I had thought about doing my PhD and doing this research towards an academic kind of degree. And I'd actually even started that process. I was going to work with a professor in the UK, Philip Zarelli, and he was, he was directing me towards readings, and we're thinking about patronage. How does patronage influence the way a form exists? And so when I started doing that research, I realized that there's no way that I can put in the stories of individual people and dancers that I knew and my own experience into an academic book. And it seemed strangely that a novel was the way to contain more truth than a nonfiction book, in a way. Like I'm not. I have nothing against. I love nonfiction, very well written nonfiction. It's very interesting and exciting to me. I love to deal with history, and I have no. It's not that I say one is, but there were certain truths about the history of Bharatanatyam that simply did not fit within the nonfiction format. And so that's when I decided to write a novel. It's like, and I didn't really know what I was doing, and I don't know if people have said that each book, like I attended a lecture by Michael Ondaatje at one point in Canada, and he said that each time he starts a book, he doesn't know what he's doing, even though he's written these incredible books, great books. And each time he's faced with the same problem. So I was faced with the problem extra because I'd never written a novel before, and it just seemed like almost an impossible task. I didn't even know how to start. But I knew that I wanted to have these kinds of stories that have been told to me in it.
Interestingly brings me to the next part of my interview, and that's it's actually a two-part question. The first one is actually slightly, I don't know if controversial is the right term, but there's a lot of debate and like a divide on this as to the devadasi system, right? Like how some people see it as a relic of a culture of a golden system being devalued and spoiled over the years into something debauched. Some see it as a absolute embodiment of a patriarchal society that existed, and see it as a blot on our history. Like there are multiple perspectives. I personally am woefully unaware of the system's depths. I know as much as any other person who's read Indian history does, which is about a paragraph on it, right? And that's unfortunately that's the truth of how Indian education system works. That there are a lot of Indian historical cultural things which we ought to know more about, are just not there. So firstly, I just want you to give me your opinion on this, and for our listeners, probably just if you could give a very quick summary or before you give your opinion on it. And actually, I'll ask you the second part of my question after you've spoken about this, because it ties into your opinion as well. So
so there it has kind of fallen into two camps as to the situation. So what the Devadasi system was a hereditary artist. If you wanted to be an artist, you had to be born into that community. So if you were a musician, you played the instrument that your father or your grandfather taught you, or your grandmother, for girls, because the Devadasi system was it really didn't devalued the men within the community quite a bit, and highly valued women, girls. And so that was kind of opposite to what was going on in general society. And in that sense, women within the Devadasi community were very literate. They were very powerful because they had access to money and they could do what they wanted. There wasn't no man telling them, you have to do this, you have to do that, except their patron. And their patron did have control over them. The king could say, oh, here, I'm sending all of you Devadasis over to Baroda. It wasn't like you had absolute control over your life. At the same time, an Indian married woman didn't necessarily have a great deal of control over her life either. So you have to kind of keep these things in your mind as you consider, is this a good system? Is it a bad system? Should we keep it? Should we not keep it? What's certainly true is that if you get rid of child marriage and you give women autonomy, you can't force them to be Devadasis. If you think of a woman as being autonomous, and if you think that you can't do something to a small child on her behalf that's irreversible, then obviously you can't dedicate a young girl to a temple and say, here, now this is what you have to do. And as soon as Indian jurisprudence, I mean, you're a lawyer, you know that, as soon as things like child marriage started to be outlawed, also you had to outlaw dedication of young girls to the temple. Now, to me, the real issue is this, what I was telling you about your sister learning dance and me learning dance. Now, when the Devadasi system was in place, a woman dancing on stage signaled her sexual availability. Now, I don't want to do a dance that signals my sexual availability. I don't want to do that. And certainly my parents would have been very, very reluctant to allow me to dance if that's what it meant. And I have to tell you that I have been approached for sexual favors up until the 1980s, or was it even the 90s? And I have witnesses that will, right in front of another person, a man came up from the audience and asked how much he would have to pay to have sex with me. So this is not a ancient history. It's history that had to be slowly decoupled from the dance, and it wasn't decoupled overnight. And so I think it was a very necessary thing for the autonomy of women that the Devadasi system had to be eradicated. I don't think that women should be, or young girls should be forced to learn dance if they don't want to. I don't think that young girls should be forced into relationships with men if they don't want to be in relationships with men. And these were aspects of the Devadasi system. And therefore, 100% it had to be eradicated, in my humble opinion. So the abolition of the Devadasi system was most important. Now, its ties to dance are very deep, and they're part of it. Like a Devadasi who danced in the temple had been learning this dance. It was part of her life. It was, she was in a relationship with the deity of the temple. I can't even imagine how that would be to lose that relationship with your own heritage. For some women who really loved that dance form. But for a woman who didn't love the dance form, to be forced to do it, it seems like it's not so making that a choice for women was also part of what allowed the dance to sustain itself. Because then the granddaughters of one of the famous Devadasis, they became, one became a librarian, one became a social scientist. So they didn't want to be dancers. Why should you
Right.
force them to be dancers just because they were born into that
Right.
community? So that's my feeling. Now, the idea that the dance was somehow taken away from the devadasis and handed over to the Brahmins is a very, it's a, it's such a misunderstanding of how dance works. You know, you can't take a dance out of
That's right.
somebody. You can't go and grab it and pull it out of them and then take it on yourself and
Right.
just wear it like a cloak or a sari. You have to devote years and years and years of your
Right.
life to learning that form, with everybody saying, oh, this is useless, this is why would you do such a thing, like why, and everybody around you saying, what a waste of time. And so I really admire those women who at great personal cost were not devadasis but loved the dance in the same way that I experienced myself and went against my own parents who didn't think this was such a great idea, and instead devoted their muscles, their bones, their very being to learning dance. So I can't, I would never say that this is um, appropriation or somehow the Devadasis were robbed by my learning dance, or especially my the woman who at the school where I learned dance, Rukmini Devi, she's often um, characterized as somebody who somehow took the dance away from the people who somehow owned it. And again, I don't think you can own art and art forms. You can buy a painting, but you can't buy a Varnam. And you can't, if I teach you a Varnam, you haven't taken it away from me. I still have it.
Right.
And even if you pay me to teach you a Varnam, you've nothing has gone out of me.
Right.
And so I love the whole idea that all kinds of people are learning it and loving it to
Right.
the extent that I did.
No,
Does
that's
that answer
that's
your question?
it actually does. Like it on it actually does. It was very enlightening. Like with
Mm,
and it does cover a lot of what intended to talk about. But it actually also kind of nudged me towards my next question, right? About uh, so you mentioned that you were approached for sexual favors, and this so the Devadasi system, as you spoke about, is uh, also by the end of it, again, like it's not something you covered in your answer, but from whatever I've gauged of it, also had an exploitative element to it, right? So my question actually was that because your book has one of the main characters who is a Devadasi, and it is a key chunk of your book, this entire system of how priests and Devadasis interact, how their patron interacts with them is, I'm sorry, his expectations from them, etc., how they are devalued, how they're insulted, etc., right? So I'm sure writing about this was not an easy task. So uh, I just wanted to know about your experience in writing about such a sensitive issue, right? To the extent that a lot of people are not very comfortable writing or talking about things that they have a personal, I know, has personally affected them, or they feel is very sensitive to for them mentally or emotionally, right? So was
mm.
this so how difficult was it to write a book which has such a sensitive topic at its core?
Well, I wanted to present a very non-judgmental picture of the Devadasi system, because, as I said, within the context in which it uh, came up, there were many aspects of it that empowered women.
Hmm.
So I didn't want to. condemn it. I didn't want to condemn the people who wanted to abolish it. I didn't want to, what I wanted to try to do is see how social norms and social conventions impacted an actual human being. And
Right.
therefore I tried to visualize this character. And one of the other things I did, I mean, because devadasis no longer really they're not even supposed to exist in India, but they are still there, not because the term has just become almost meaningless with the way it's applied here, there, and everywhere. But in Karnataka, there are women who face some of the same traumas that devadasis in Tamil Nadu faced. They don't have a dance system, but they are associated with temples, and they are associated with sex work. So I think of the devadasi system as a kind of religiously sanctioned sex workers. That's
Mm.
what. That's how I think of the devadasi. I mean, if you want a totally non-judgmental terminology, that's one way to think of it. Who had an artistic and ritual connection to the temple, and they also had patronage obligations. And when I went and spoke to these women, and I spoke to the women who are devadasis in northern Karnataka, and I found that there was a great range of experiences. Like one girl, one woman that I met had been with the same man for 30 years. She was with him through his marriage. She helped to arrange the marriage of his kids, and she wasn't, there was nothing like a prostitute about her whatsoever. She hadn't lived that kind of life. But at the other spectrum were young girls who had been dedicated because their parents were poor,
Mhm.
and didn't come didn't meet a man who wanted to be with them for the rest of his life. And when they tried to, with the help of NGOs and whatever, they tried to get, for example, they were trained in hotel management. And so they
Mhm.
could get a job as a receptionist at a hotel. And then somehow or the other, the patrons or the people in the village or people in the town, because it's like even if you moved from your village to some other place in North Karnataka, and you started working as a receptionist at a hotel, if anybody came to know that you came from that devadasi background, they would automatically force you back into sex work. And so it is an incredibly exploitative system if you believe in women's autonomy. If you don't believe in women's autonomy, and then lots of the Hindu religion doesn't believe in women's autonomy. A lot of Hindu religion says, you have to do what your caste role is, you have to
Right.
do what your husband tells you, you have to do what your father tells you, you have to do what the priest tells you. And so these women were very much trapped.
Right.
And I and the other thing is they were so incredibly open and generous with their experiences with me. When they talked to me about their own experiences, it was with such generosity of spirit. And
Right.
so then it made it much easier for me to write about it. I don't think I could have done it if I didn't have their example of how, they were joking and telling me stories, and it was an amazing experience. And I tried to, to bring those actual women's experiences with a system that shared those characteristics with the devadasi system in Tamil Nadu, bring them into my writing is a non-judgmental way as I could, the same way they were. Like, they weren't saying, "Oh, my parents were terrible, they did this to me." saying my parents were poor, and this is this is what I had to do in order to help support my family. And it was an eye-opening experience, and it really informs the way I think about the whole system.
Gitanjali, that brings us to the end of our interview. I just have one last question before I wrap this up. So now
Yeah.
that the Gold Made of Gold is coming out soon, what's next on the anvil? Is there another book, or
Well,
anything that we
you'll see that I've conceived of Girl Made of Gold as one of three interlinked novels that tell kind of the history of South Indian
Right.
art forms. And so one thing that happened is devadasis, many of them, quite a few of them, went from being dancers to being acting in films. Like
Right.
the way art forms kind of evolved. There was no such thing as filmmaking, right?
Right.
Filmmaking had to be invented, and the first way they invented it was by just taking their traditional theater forms and kind of putting them in front of the camera. And so if you want to see devadasis today, the way you do it is by looking at films of that period. And devadasis moved into the film industry, and the men who were much devalued within the devadasi community when it was dependent on the patronage of high caste men, then they went into the musical aspects of it and into the script writing.
Right.
And people from that community of artists, that artist community, they did go into film in a pretty big way. And so it's a very natural transition. And so my next murder mystery will be set in the film, the early cinema of South India, not Bollywood cinema, which there are many similarities, of course, but
it's a different.
it's quite different, and it has a different history, and even now, and the way South Indian movies and politics is interlinked is really, really fascinating to me. So that's my next project.
That's something that's really something I really look forward to. Well, thank you, Gitanjali, for doing this. This was great. I'm sure all my listeners would have loved this. We really look forward to your next work. And yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you so much for engaging in this way. It was really fun for me too.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you really like this interview, you can check out our post about the book and actually buy the book through the links mentioned in the description box below.